Though his book was written over 2,000 years ago, James had something to say about our current war on peace. In his epistle, James reminds that genuine faith is one whereby our words meet our actions. For James says in chapter 2, verse 15 to 17, if a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warm and filled, without then giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? To me, as a parent, that sounds eerily familiar to the thoughts and prayers that we now send after every tragic school shooting. Without the faith-filled, stronger actions of gun control. This note hit us especially hard as a community this week, where we live in Beverly, Massachusetts, because we experienced gun violence last weekend. Less than a half a mile from our house. On Saturday evening, a shooting occurred between two high school students. The victim being a student at our local Beverly High School, also a half mile away. The note from our superintendent went out on Tuesday saying, quote, as a district, we take safety and security as our most important role. Students cannot learn, and staff cannot work in unsafe environments. We are routinely reviewing our safety protocols. We plan for the unknown. And we strive to make sure that your children make it home safely every day. As a parent, that message doesn't feel like nearly enough. In fact, it feels so unaligned to what I have learned and my understanding of James's message of Jesus that I found myself initially disappointed with the response from our administration. Although lately, as a community, let alone as a country, it feels as though so many are poorly clothed and lacking in our most basic resources. And the response to such blatant need seems to be tossing more Band-Aids and prayers and protocols instead of actually checking in and seeing what we may need. It all reminds me of Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Emeritus of Cape Town and Nobel Peace Laureate, a veteran anti-apartheid activist and peace campaigner who was widely regarded as South Africa's moral conscience. While I could speak for days about his laughter, his joy, his children's Bible, what comes to mind today is how Tutu handled conflict transformation and the tides of change within his own country, and how he embraced one of his favorite parables as the vehicle for transformation. We've probably all heard the parable of the Good Samaritan, I suppose. A parable from our holy text which reminds us to love and care for our neighbor. And yet Martin Luther King Jr. argued that while this parable is an example of kindness, the truer message around change requires the action steps of walking back up the road to see why someone might have needed to be cared for in the first place. The only way for us to obtain social change is through conflict transformation. Which brings me back to Desmond Tutu. While we may have heard the story of the Great Samaritan, we may not have heard the story of the river. Desmond Tutu's favorite parable, which he explains, there was a river in Africa that flowed through one of their villages. One day, a person was floating by that needed their help. Together, all of the villagers came as one and pulled this person out of the river to help them heal their wounds and then rest in their homes for a few days. A day or so later, just as the man was beginning to heal, another body began floating down the river. And again, all the villagers came together to pull the person out of the water and care for them in that moment. This continued for a couple of weeks, with a body or so arriving every few days, until one day, one of the villagers looked at the others and asked why they kept seeing bodies in their river, why this kept happening. And so they decided as a village to send that person and 2 or 3 others up the river a few miles, where they discovered that there was a bridge with a hole in it. People were walking over the bridge and falling through the hole and into the river. So those few villagers met with the surrounding villages. They put a sign near the bridge to alert people that the hole was there in the first place. And then they came together as multiple communities to fix the hole so that no one again fell into the river. Tutu reminds us in this parable that we cannot have social change without conflict transformation, which I've said twice already, so I'll say it again. We cannot have social change without conflict transformation. Well, I'll pause here and explain, as was said in my bio, that conflict transformation is one of my favorite things that I got to learn in seminary. And yet, what is the difference between that and a conflict resolution? So conflict resolution is that moment where you've solved something. You've gotten through a contract negotiation, a teaching strike, or an obstacle in a family argument, maybe a tiff with a roommate. When it's over, you might not actually feel any better. It still feels a little bit sticky. That might be a resolution. You've fixed something, but then it's hard to move forward and you don't know how to move on. On the other hand, there are many times that you may have worked through an argument and come up with a very creative solution to move forward together that just felt easy and miraculous, that you worked through and you discussed and you worked on it together. That is conflict transformation. Right now, there seems to be a lot of transformation that is needed across the world. And if yesterday's protests across the country, but also globally, don't seem loud enough, I challenge us to seek the ways in which God is asking each of us to show up. For James says, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? If we need to change as a whole, how are we going to plant the seeds of change and move forward? And what are those seeds to begin with?" But before we get there and ask all sorts of curious questions, I'll back up and ask first, who is James? And what can we learn about peace in his short epistle? James was likely the half-brother of Jesus, a peacemaker, a wise leader, and one full of courage. Over the course of our lifetime, we will all need those same characteristics of peace and wisdom and courage to overcome the obstacles of simply what it means to live 2,000 years after Jesus' reminders to love our neighbors. And in the face of all this, James asked us for perfection, which might seem wild to some of us as we face all of the needed changes towards peace, kindness, and love. But when we are made whole or complete or perfect, it is because we live and act in faith, instead of walking with fractured faith. Excuse me. Being made whole or perfect to James is the reminder to walk the walk, to pray, to listen, to help when you hear what another person needs. And if this all still seems a little bit fluffy, we might need time to remember that this is a moment when we can find what we call our moral imagination, a grounded, centered, and very playful place to be, or, as James's creative writing reminds me from the musical Rent, the opposite of war isn't peace, it's creation. In other words, James reminds us to live our lives vibrantly and out loud, praising God, having actions of faith, good, trouble, and a touch of tutu or kings, creative reimaginings. The best way to create resistance is by walking in genuine faith with joy and art and music. And here's the thing. What if, instead of showing up with fear, we showed up in this fearful time with as much faith and whimsy and creativity as we can? What if God is asking us to reimagine the world? And what if, hear me out, what if it turned out better than we could have ever imagined? It brings me to those seeds of change that I alluded to earlier. And we heard quite a few of them in our children's message from Sophia today. Be friendly, share what you have, listen and help. Love is not just about showing up with our words, but with our actions. And if we can sit in the seat of imagining, I wonder what other seeds we can plant. What notes James is asking us to sing, or the best ways that we can move forward as a whole. And while we need a lot of changes on a global scale, one note that came to me comes from another James, a young Texas state representative who loves Jesus and is bringing his faith into politics in a way that I find curious and makes my heart sing. James Tallarico, who's from Texas, argued against hanging the 10 Commandments in the classroom, which may seem wild for a Christian. However, he quoted, "I love the 10 Commandments. I have built my whole life on them." The Apostle Paul wrote in Romans 13, the commandments are summed up, as did James. Love is the fulfillment of the law. Love your neighbor as yourself. The Hindu student who sits in a classroom is our neighbor, and we are called to love them as ourselves. Tallarico is just one person with a dream of kindness and change, offering Christian love to all, and challenging policies created to make change. And yet, in order to begin shifting, to challenge ourselves, to create faithful welcomes in times of fearful change, it begins with just one person or one note. Which brings me all the way back to the superintendent. After almost a week of conversations with parents and community members and people in our towns, he came to send a more robust email 2 days ago. And as a parent, I'm proud to consider standing behind it. He says, quote, "As a community that reaches from sea to shining sea, we should not have our fruited plains and purple majesties be colored with the blood of our brotherhood, sisterhood, or our youth. We have a duty to make the world a better place for the next generation, and a duty is a moral obligation. We have a moral obligation to change our society for the better. And that obligation requires us as educators and as others to reach out and find common ground, to find ways in which we can support and love each other. And we can only do this when we come together across our differences and resolve things through dialogue. We actually have to do the hard work to make the world better." I couldn't agree more. And while I still have many curious questions around how we are actually going to do that, and still pray every day that I will never receive another email around striving to send my child home safely after being educated at school, I do believe that it is a start in the right direction towards peace. So let us trust in a God who will bring peace by asking us to become the perfect beings by matching our words, notes, and actions of love together. Let us do the hard work to make the world better by placing our trust in a God who reminds us to not only love our neighbor, but to fill the gaps in all our broken bridges. Amen.